Good. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for dialing in. Most of you have been coming, but this is another of our great sessions today. I'm Christian Harrison, and I'm privileged to be the facilitator of the research seminar series of the School of Business and Creative Industries of the University of West of Scotland. And gladly, we won the best university of the year. That was yesterday, isn't it? The Regress Award. So that's good. It means that we are doing something fantastic within Scotland and the world at large. But either way, it's great to have everyone here, and I'm so happy. Thanks, John. I'm so happy that we're here today. I'm glad to see people here, and we have a very special speech or talk today, and we also have a very special guest today as well. But before I talk about Wojciech, of course, it's great. Like I always say, we have the chat space, so feel free to introduce yourself on the chat. Say hi, tell us where you're coming from. I know we have some old people and we have some new ones here as well. So you can use the chat, tell us who you are, and just try to engage. It's not compulsory that you put your cameras off, so you can decide to put your cameras on. Sometimes it's great to place a face to the name. So don't be shy, you can always put your cameras on. But of course, if you want to put your cameras off as well, we're happy for you to do that. But most importantly, unfortunately, it's not a face-to-face session. So if there is anything happening in your house, a fire alarm or anything, don't hesitate to leave your house. So you don't need to stay here. And if there's crisis, in quotes. But it's great to have everyone here today. And we'll be talking about something very, very special. We've been running so many series, but today is a very, very critical one. And I like the frame, and it's the topic itself, looking at the IT service delivery. And I like the way it has been framed, saying the messiness of the IT service delivery sector, and looking at it from the knowledge and knowledge-based explanation. So today we're looking at all that. Why is the IT service delivery messy in the first place? What can we learn from knowledge management? And today we have a very accomplished expert in the field, and his name is Dr. Wojciech Kwiatkowski, and he will be telling us so much more about it. So that's something that we have been waiting for. And thanks, Wojciech. When I approached him about it, he was happy and was keen to do this. So it's great to have him finally here today. So I'm so excited about it. But before we continue, I would like to introduce Wojciech so you can get to know the person that is going to talk today. And Wojciech is a lecturer in business and management at our university, the School of Business and Creative Industries. Of course, he has a PhD, so he's Dr. Wojciech. And he has been moving around. Clearly, he was in the University of Manchester. He has a PhD where he got his PhD from. He also draws on practice, theorizing and exploring organizational knowledge and learning. And he has an interest in scrutinizing the harmony of dissonance between scholarly accounts of knowing and knowing involved in research practice. So this is somebody that is very well accomplished and looks at organizational life in course in general. And he has, of course, gotten so much, he has published a lot within this area. He has written papers within this area, and he's an expert in knowledge management. And of course, especially when you look at the critical management of this perspective. That is a very, a synopsis of the kind of speaker you have. And we are privileged to have Wojciech here with us today. And I think rather than talk too much, I will let Wojciech take over, and he will tell us so much about the messiness of IT service delivery. So thank you, Wojciech.
Thanks for the introduction, Christian. That was the most anyone has ever oversold me. I think the pinnacle of my achievement right now is the PhD I got, rather than any meaningful publications, although I presented at some conferences, but thank you anyway. Anyhow, so let's get some slides up. Right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for coming, even though there's just a handful of you, but hopefully you will nonetheless not run away halfway through the presentation. Although I wouldn't blame you if you did, because some of the stuff is least to say unorthodox. Anyhow, in terms of my own introduction, so Christian kind of covered most of it. My background is knowledge and learning, specifically analyzed from a practice standpoint. which basically rejects the idea of knowledge management as an oxymoron. It's not something we believe is possible. I think it's simplified, and I'll actually cover that to a certain extent. And but I also dabble in critical management studies. Specifically, I use practice theorizing in a way which is meant to be critical, and explores power and conflict and dissonance. I even have a chapter upcoming in an encyclopedia of critical management studies on practice theorizing as something which is not part of the canon but can be used in a critical frame. Now, something a little bit more background relevant to today is that for a long time I actually wanted to work in IT, and I even completed a high school program which was meant to prepare me for a career in IT. But I hated physics, and that's something you needed back in the day to actually get into an IT program. So that didn't pan out. Then I dabbled in law, which I found really boring when I actually tried doing it in a corporate law firm. And so I ended up here somehow. Long story short. Now, if you want to know more about me, you can scan the QR code on the right hand side, or you can just, it will basically take you to my pure profile on our university website. So anyhow, so the plan for today is I'm going to talk first about the naive portrayal of KIBS, of the delivery of knowledge intensive business services in general, rather than just IT. I'll tell you how I thought when I came up with this research project for my PhD, how we could solve it, how we could be a little bit less naive. And then I'll kind of outline the more theoretical frame, and that's the research methodology, and then I'll cover the messiness, or sort of like 6 different explanations of messiness, which actually come from 3 different ways of thinking about knowledge. And then I'll give you some recommendations for practitioners. There's going to be an opportunity for audience participation at one point, so it's like a mad show essentially. But don't worry, I'm not going to saw someone in half. It will be fun to do that online though. Anyway, so when you think about IT services firms, they're actually part of a larger umbrella of firms called knowledge intensive business services firms. And what these firms do, according to the canonical account, is they collect, transfer, and apply technical or professional knowledge to solve the strategic problems faced by the clients, who quite often are involved in some capacity in the development of the service solution. Yeah, quite a lot of services provided by KIBS, even if they have a material component like a software, are designed with the client in mind. Yeah, so for example, if you want to build a software which is specific to you, you need to input into that production process. You're buying you're trying to design an advertising campaign, same thing. You kind of need to lay out your expectations, what matters to your brand, that kind of stuff. Yeah, there's room for involvement. Now, all varieties of knowledge-intensive services are believed to be very important to the so-called knowledge-intensive economy because, well, what they allegedly do is they combine knowledge from various sources and subsequently distribute it. Yeah. So the idea is that they are in a certain way spreading this best practice. Now, that's the happy-go-lucky, let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya argument. But there's a skeptical view on it. One, the knowledge which is supposedly involved, and this is largely derived from the work of Matt Alvesson, who devoted about 20 years of his career to this topic. So Alvesson argues that the knowledge that actually services firms, marketing agencies are in, various types of consultancy, strategy, IT services, and so on. The knowledge they actually provide has no scientific qualities, and that means it cannot stand ground on its own. There's no way of assessing that it's valid, correct, beneficial, or not. In fact, what happens is, so what the entire service delivery process is about is just a lot of rhetoric, client management, and in some cases, even manipulating your client. Yeah, to believe that what you're buying is actually going to make them better, even though the causation is a little bit hard to establish in many cases. Now, the other problem is that, in this idealistic, sort of like organizations that distribute best practices and understandings, yeah, it's actually a very idealistic portrayal of what these companies do. The relations between them are not symmetric. Yeah, it's not like 2 friends having a conversation and exchanging ideas. The interests of the provider of a knowledge-intensive business service, such as an IT service, and those of the clients are misaligned. Yeah, just think about it this way. When you want someone to design you a piece of software from the perspective of the provider, you kind of want to use what you've used for your other clients ideally, and maybe customize it. Yeah. If something bespoke is necessary, you want to charge extra for it. Now, from the perspective of the client, like in most cases, you kind of want to pay the least, but get the most. Yeah. So, it's not this amazing relationship, partnership rooted in mutual understanding and mutual benefit. The other thing is that projects in knowledge-intensive business services fail not because there are technical failures quite often, but because there are more fundamental failures of understanding, associated with misunderstandings. Okay, so what I think happens actually is something a little bit more fun. What I thought when I started my PhD was happening was actually something much more fundamental. That was a problem with the literature itself. I thought that the process was very naive, idealistic, and in some cases biased in favor of management. And if you actually look through the publications dealing with knowledge-intensive business services firms, you'll find that they deal almost exclusively with inter-organizational phenomena, even though they recognize that things happen in social interactions between, people who actually get their hands dirty. But the solution to a good project is, for example, things like alignment of learning strategies, or what was the other good one to use here? Or finding the correct client organization, the right type of a client organization, and so on. In other words, we're kind of focusing on things as if they were happening between organizations, and organizations were somehow distinct from people that are actually getting the job done. Which goes to the second point, which is, okay, so the way we think about the process of delivering a service, not the service itself, is that we think of it as something that happens between organizations, and there's little mention of what happens between the people involved. The fact that they represent different backgrounds, objectives, they have different interests, areas of competence, and so on. In fact, the knowledge flow is explained from a very inter-organizational perspective, so very high level sort of thinking, which is very nicely aligned with what you will find in a lot of knowledge management literature. Now, the other problem is that the process is linear, or at least it's portrayed as predominantly linear. What do we mean by this? So here are two examples. What you can see is that supposedly the way a KIBS project of any type happens is that we start off with some kind of requirement gathering / definitional stage, then we make the solution, then we deliver it to the client, it becomes actually implemented, and that's how things go. There is this linear progression. So because I wanted to work in IT, even though after high school I abandoned that idea, I did know a lot of people who ended up working in IT. So actually, as much as I like, criticizing and undermining management in all shapes, sizes, and forms, what I didn't want to be, I didn't want to fight for something that wasn't there. So I actually showed these to my friends and my brother who worked at IBM at that time. And courtesy to my friend's sense of humor, the comparisons were brilliant. So in one case, somebody said that this is the kind of nonsense which is why my manager is useless. And the other one was, it looks like my work is as Disney princess. I just want to know if I'm the princess in the movie. They were pretty much disgusted with how naive this was. So how can we solve it? My idea was that the fundamental problem here is that we have borrowed conceptualization of knowledge from strategic management literature, which is problematic, inherently problematic. One, for two reasons. One, it commoditizes organizational knowledge. What this means is that we think of knowledge as something transferable, a thing that ideally an organization is a container for. Now this is convenient because if knowledge exists at a distinct organizational level, then obviously the people in control of it are the management, rather than people who actually get the job done. That's in fact, that is pretty much the premise of the idea that knowledge can be managed. We have to make it organizational level, which is distinct from the people, in order for it to actually become fully manageable. The other problem is the other problem of the strategic management perspective, which this beautiful linear portrayal relies on is that it anthropomorphizes organizational knowledge and learning. Essentially, kind of related to the first point, there is a distinct type of organizational knowledge and learning that organizations do that is separate in some way from what individual members of the organizations do. Now, it's worth pointing out that the opposite idea that, okay, an organization, well, opposite, related idea that an organization is a collection of, individual knowledges is equally flawed, because what an individual knows does not explain what actually happens when knowledge is put to use. So to me, that was the problem. That was what was the reason behind this linear portrayals that kind of didn't really voice the concerns of people actually delivering knowledge-intensive business services, including IT services. So how do I think I could solve it? So to me, the remedy was the remedy that would allow me to elucidate that, as my friends and family pointed out, IT service delivery can be very messy, is to start off with a different way of thinking about knowledge. And there is a robust critique of why the strategic management conception of knowledge as a thing that exists at an organization level is flawed. The problem is that it does not one approach but several. Yeah. In short, they can have been described as an epistemology of possession, where we still think of knowledge as a thing, but residing in human heads predominantly, and an epistemology of practice, where we think about knowledge as something that is done. And in fact, we abandon the term knowledge altogether. We focus on knowing. So going back to the problem of there's too many perspectives here. So the epistemology of possession and practice is just one very general distinction. Within epistemology of practice, we can then break it down into a host of different approaches rooted in communities of practice, so situated learning theory, cultural historical activity theory, actor network theory, and so on. So it's a little bit hard to pick which conceptualization you're going to use to reinterpret service delivery with. So what I did, I kind of chose three, or I devised, more specifically, I devised three theoretical lenses by cutting through all this literature. One was rooted predominantly in what is known as knowledge creation theory. So, the good old famous distinction between tacit and explicit knowledge, although applied in the way Polanyi intended it, and Nonaka and Takeuchi, and not how it has been misappropriated later on as a managerial level construct. Communities of practice literature, which bridged the more cognitive views of knowledge, so knowledge residing in the head, with more practice-based views of knowledge, and ultimately what I refer to as the landscape of practices knowledge, which was essentially something that was derived from the more recent research in practice theorizing, which focus on how different practices within and across organizations connect, creating certain regimes of accountability, power, and specific forms of organizing. Now, go to the next slide. I'm going to need a volunteer. So who would like to go?
Okay, I can volunteer.
So who's volunteering?
Wojciech, yeah, I'm happy to volunteer.
Okay, Christian, explain to me how to ride a bicycle.
Oh, that was not the best question. I don't know how to ride a bicycle, Wojciech.
Okay, can you swim?
No. Are you sure you don't have a better one? Is there anybody that can swim or ride a bike? I think I'm the wrong person.
Yeah, I can swim. I can ride a bike.
Okay.
Okay, how to ride a bicycle? Explain it to me. Make it explicit.
Okay, I will try my best. When I want to ride a bike, what I do is, especially if my bike is this is locked. The first thing I do is I unlock my bike, and after I unlock it, I hold one of the handle, then put my one leg on the floor. I fly another one over the bike to the other side. Then I hold the pedal with my leg. Get stead on the seat. Then I start to roll the pedals from one side to the other. I also control the bike, my movement with the two hands and the brake.
Okay, how do you stay balanced? What do you need to know to stay balanced?
I say balance because I think based on the center of gravity, the way I sit on the seat and the way I position my body, I think.
Okay, how do you know where your center of gravity is?
Because I'm still on this. I think I'm still on the bike.
Okay, how do you ensure that your center of gravity stays on the bike so that you can remain still?
I try to sit straight.
Okay, why do you have to sit straight?
Because
what if you get a side wind? How do you balance that?
You know, I just maneuver. I just maneuver myself anyway. So far, I'm still on the bike, and I know that I'm stable, and that's a light.
Okay. The key word there is you just know.
Yeah.
When you ride, you don't think about the bicycle being separate from you. You don't think about the road being separate from you. Obviously, you pay attention to what's happening around you. You don't pay attention to the wind. You don't think about your center of mass. You don't think about any of that. You just embrace riding. Yeah. It's only, in fact, you will probably only notice the bike when it breaks down and you cannot ride anymore. Yeah, that's when the bike will enter what is known as your focal awareness. You will see it. Now, the point of this exercise was to show you that in order to explain any activity, there is like the cognitive view tells us that there's a rule, but that rule that needs to be interpreted or applied in a specific way. So it hangs on another rule and another rule and another rule, and we can keep going at this until the end of time. This is known as the problem of infinite regress, that you need always a rule to apply a rule and get things done.
Yeah.
Practice theorizing tries to avoid this. That's essentially the aim, the goal. So some epistemic work done in the engagement with the practice itself. In fact, it assumes that rather than thinking about the knowledge that resides in our head, we should think about the knowledge that rests in the practice itself. Yeah. Like riding a bicycle, it's something you simply do. Same way, you're hammering a nail, you don't think about your hand, the hammer, you just hammer away. So that's the difference essentially between epistemology of possession and practice. Epistemology of possession thinks that knowledge is a substance, yeah, although not in some kind of tangible or liquid or stable form. It's a thing that resides in the mind. And potentially can be also, embedded eventually in an artifact. Knowing and learning happens in your head. And different aspects of knowledge can be distinguished, yes? So certain things are easier to talk about, so they're more explicit, and others are more tacit. But there's always, because there's always a rule to a rule, there's always something inexplicable, essentially. Yeah. There's a limit to how far we can explain how we get things done. So rather than types, it's more about moving along a continuum, as Nonaka and Takeuchi actually pointed it out when they first came up with the idea distinction between tacit and explicit knowledge. It's a continuum, not two types. And there is a relationship between them, yeah? In terms of, as things become more explicit, what does it mean for how it's conveyed to others? What can they make with it? What are the limitations that come from tacitness? Now, epistemology of practice, as I pointed out, is about ignoring all of that and focusing on what happens when people actually get things done. What is a competent performance? What feeds into it? What epistemic work is done in that performance itself? So the idea here is to focus on knowing and learning as social and participatory. Even when you ride a bicycle, you're not riding a bicycle on your own. You have other road users around you. You have pedestrians, cars. If you're on a country road, there's a chance you're going to come across a sheep. All of this contributes towards the practice of riding the bicycle. So, in other words, rather than thinking about the knowledge we have, we should focus on practice as the explanation of social life and how things get competently done. We should think about knowing and not knowing. The problem is that within practice theorizing, as I pointed out before, there's multiple different strands. So in terms of how the three perspectives that were the lenses in were developed. So this is essentially a summary of 20,000 words of literature review in one table. So it's very diluted, but just to give you just to explain it in a little detail. So from the knowledge creation theory perspective, knowledge is residing. To know is to be able to act. Therefore, practice is a representation of the knowledge we hold. Tacit and explicit knowledge from a continuum. Knowledge can be embedded in artifacts, both symbolic and material. And the last thing that knowledge creation theory is leans towards is this idea that consensus is ultimately achieved between collaborators, even though it may be tentative. Now, on the practice side of the table, so the communities of practice and landscape of practices lenses, knowledge, or more accurately knowing, does not reside in the mind, but is situated in practice. There is a relational ontology, which means that there is no me, things, agency, subject, object, and so on. None of that exists on its own. It exists in a relation to something else. So in order, we need to have the entire system of academia that in order for us to actually be able to call ourselves one. If universities vanished and nobody remembered what they were, we would no longer be able to call ourselves academics because nobody would recognize us as one. Power is involved in knowledge interactions, both within people with similar backgrounds and across people with other backgrounds. And this power is performative. So it's not about domination. I have a senior position over you, but through my actions have a power effect. So in other words, your manager is actually exercising his power over you through his actions rather than through his position. Power is a performance rather than something you own or hold. From a communities of practice standpoint, individuals not acquire knowledge in isolation, but by participating in shared social practice, and they are invested in that knowledge. So when people from different practices try to collaborate, conflicts unfold, there's inconsistencies, incongruencies, there's a mess. You can use boundary objects to help with this collaboration if they're mutually recognizable, but they can also be used to exercise power. You can enshrine your understanding in a document and force it onto someone else without them even realizing it, so that, for example, a project is defined the way you want it to be defined. Now, from the landscape of practice perspective, it's kind of touches on the same notes, but the idea is that we shouldn't focus just on, let's say, people from two different professional backgrounds interacting, two professional communities interacting. We should instead think about the entire landscape of practices that connect in different dimensions. So as academics, we have our line managers, we have practice outside our organization that define how academia should work and so on. We have our students have families, societal expectations. All of these practices and the connection between them give identity and form to how academia happens, for example, in the classroom. The other contribution of this research is that humans and non-humans both have agency, although different types. In other words, artifacts such as software can talk back to us, essentially. They can frustrate us. They have agentic capacity the same way as we do. And the final point comes with the understanding that it's the practice arrangement so these practices that connect in different ways throughout reality, really, that create regimes of empowerment and disempowerment. So why certain people become rule followers and maybe setting in place, in a simplified explanation. So I had these three lenses that would allow me to potentially reveal this messiness that I was seeking for, and my friends told me and family told me about, but I needed a methodology for it. Traditionally, practice theorizing uses ethnographies. The problem is, and here's a little bit of self-promotion, the organization I initially had lined up quit on me literally the month I was supposed to start collecting. So I spent 5 months cold calling mainly and sending emails repeatedly. And about 70 to 80 organizations later, I found someone that would allow me to do something that hopefully would give me the empirical material I needed, but with a lot of restrictions because they happen to be a provider of specialized IT services to central banks, payment processing companies, and the biggest banks you can see on the high street. Which basically meant that I was not allowed to, for example, take out any documentation if I had any client records because of the NDAs they had with their clients. I could not sit in a meeting in which customer names or data was mentioned. And there was a lot of control that restricted my ability to observe. So I had to improvise a new methodology, and I looked into interpretivist case study research, something which is not exactly popular in management especially, but has a long tradition in qualitative research. The idea is to focus on the particular and basically provide as much detail as possible with very little concern for generalizability, because in principle, case studies, no matter how many do, will never reach the level of generalizability that comes, for example, with survey research and so on. So it's a futile attempt. Yeah, it's basically a form of intellectual enslavement by a very positive generalization and trying to fit in as desperately as you can. Interpretivist case studies just ignore it. They say it's the value of knowledge comes in richness of how we portray things, how deeply we understand them, and how we write about it so that our readers can make their own minds as well, rather than just relying on what we tell them. So in terms of data collection, the usual, I had some non-participating observations, which I could do in a very controlled environment. So quite often I would be only allowed on site on a day when things were not meant to be very busy and there was not much client-specific things being considered. I was banned from all meetings where client-sensitive information was considered. I could take some documents, printouts from software and so on, and all the other stuff, but these had to be sanitized, or I had to use templates rather than a complete document because of NDAs my case study organization had with the clients. The bulk of my data came from interviews, which were also very important because, well, like most IT services companies, this company does not work on one project. It works on multiple projects at the same time. Yeah. In other words, it's not like you follow a project from day one till the end. Something can happen. Priorities may change. One day somebody can be working for 5 different clients. There's no linearity. So tracing the connections between, how typical work unfolds kind of was something that was difficult to capture through observations. The interviews really helped with understanding how the process of service delivery unfolded over time. So now the real really came from the analysis, because I had these 3 theoretical lenses, but I was not intending on doing a deductive study where I just have a predefined conceptual framework and I just plaster it over my data and I get something out of it. So the idea was to embrace abduction. And there are the abductive research methods, ones that really appreciate that, what happens when you analyze data with a mindset is that you plug in the data and the theory into one another, which should technically expand your understanding of theory while also enriching the understanding of the data beyond that which is obvious. So I kind of reached into the depths of social sciences to find these methods, and one way to label them was diffractive analysis. And the idea is simple. You take some fairly broad theoretical concepts from what inspires your thinking, and you use those concepts to out questions, to push your understanding of both the empirical material and the theory beyond its limits. In other words, you should walk away with not only an explanation of the empirical, but also a refinement of the theory that went in. These methods are rooted in the critique of coding-based approaches in social sciences. Yeah. So in other words, they're a little bit of a hard sell with mainstream audiences. Because they essentially say that coding explains nothing. Because it just gives you the structure of your data, but it doesn't actually tell you why you've actually interpreted in this way or why you came up with this being an important theme and so on. Or at most they reduce it to, these themes were created because this issue was mentioned, but why was this issue important to you as the researcher? Coding quite often does not go into this much level of detail. If you read a paper and they're kind enough to include the coding scheme is just a hierarchical order. That's it. So this is sort of like the critique that kind of promotes this idea of post-coding qualitative analysis that embraces abduction. So in my case, I plugged in the key concepts initially. So tacit and explicit continuum, the notion of a community of practice, and the idea of residential agential humanism, which means that people in art and material and non-humans participate, but in different ways, that people are a little bit in the driving seat, but artifacts cannot be ignored. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because it touches more on the theoretical aspect of the research rather than the more empirical about why is service delivery messy. But long story short, that those initial concepts proved not enough. I had to plug in some more robust concepts to refine my thinking. And all of that led to some level of concept development that kind of altered the way these concepts should be understood compared to what the literature said about them already. So let's go to the messiness. So a little bit of background about Montag. So as I said already, they provide services to the financial services industry. Bulk of those services is quite specific. Started in 1989, went through some changes in ownership. The big one was in 2015. What it meant basically was that now they were supposed to focus on maintaining the revenue from existing projects rather than taking on new ones, which basically kind of give them room to make new things for existing clients, but nothing radical. Now, in terms of the software, it's like a Lego set of parts. Yeah, it's very customizable. You have to essentially tailor it to a particular customer, and the bigger problem comes that it has to live on a system which quite often is distributed as a network, because that's just the nature of the financial industry and their IT infrastructure. So in terms of who participates in this process, we have development staff from Montag, we have support staff and one person at the help desk, and then we have typically clients business staff, so people who order a software, and the technical staff, which is more well versed in the technical aspects of the infrastructure of the IT infrastructure of the client. And then we sometimes have Montag's distributors who find clients and are a middleman when it comes to faults with the software, and infrastructure providers. Now, the process itself, rather than being that nice linear thing we saw at the beginning, is more like this. At each step, there's a lot of back and forth. And, at every step, you can always go back almost to the very beginning. You think you have the requirements gathering? Well, probably they'll be refined when the client actually does an acceptance test. So the client first sees the software in place. Or chances are, but since acceptance tests are normally performed by technical staff rather than business staff, chances are that only when the ultimate user sits on it and the software enters the maintenance period, you're going to be actually getting a clear idea of what they wanted in the first place. That's basically how it works. Even things like, how much hardware we need for our software to run can be revisited when it goes live. So what are the problems here? New technical problems reveal themselves as we go. It is not possible to replicate the client's software and hardware and requirement on the company's software is meant to live. There are security and access related restrictions. There are conflicts over the urgency of fixes. Sometimes, in some cases, the client technical staff may not be sufficiently committed. Distributors act primarily for the client and not the provider. There are network ownership politics, especially when third-party infrastructure providers are involved. And clients do not know exactly what they want until the end user actually starts playing with the software. Why do we have these problems? One, you're not designing a tool. You're not designing a product, but a tool, which means, it will change the way people work. So you're essentially at the very start of a project, you're essentially asking somebody a question, tell me how you did, you're asking someone about a future way of action, about a future practice which doesn't exist yet. It's bound to be inaccurate. Yeah, this does not mean that these articulations are meaningless. They are useful. They push project forward. They are helpful in, aligning multiple projects at the same time so that your work progresses on all of them. The second problem is that the software itself does not embed that knowledge at all. Because just because, I don't know, using a paper form, someone did something in one way, that does not actually translate or somehow form the software which will do things in a different way. Creation of software is not a matter of the combination. Software developers, testers, and so on, they need to put their knowledge to work in order to create it. It's not a simple matter of, conversion, as some would argue. Now, The second problem is that the related problem is that this knowledge that you're getting from the client, who has a very different understanding, is complementary knowledge. It allows you to act and develop a software, but each time they speak to you about it, they speak about it from their practical standpoint, how they think they would use it, and that can be very different from the type of understanding that someone in development would need to actually write the software. Yeah, so each time you get that information, you're kind of reinterpreting it, which means that, well, you quite often, especially in the early stages, keep asking for more information because it's like you're speaking different languages. In fact, the different practical circumstances mean that even knowledge which is arguably very explicit, like the IT environment of the client organization, is not something that may be effectively passed on to the provider. Yeah, because the client doesn't exactly know what aspects of the IT system matter to your software. The other problem, kind of related to this, is that there's incommensurability and disjointedness of meaning. So the software is meaningful in different ways. Some clients think they're buying something like a washing machine, in the words of one of my research participants, but others see it as a service and they really want to become involved in the design. Yeah, what you're going to get affects the interactions, how much information you're getting, how responsive people are, and so on. Secondly, ultimately, there's only one way to write a software, or one type of understanding you can write it on, the development understanding. So ultimately, that's the understanding that needs to prevail. There is no, you're simply trying to feed the developer's understanding. They dominate the process in a way. Now, and the last thing is that typically of what you can imagine, everyone keeps acting in their own interest. The client doesn't want to contribute too much, it will be hard to force them to. In fact, sometimes you have to walk away from a project. They want something done fast because it serves their interests, their practices. Okay, but dropping everything for a client meant derail together on multiple projects at the same time. Yeah, there is no beautiful partnership. There's a lot of pushing back and forth. In fact, what is actually the people who dominate this process, or the understanding and the practice that dominates all of this, is development. They are in a more empowered position compared to anyone else, including other people in Montec and their clients. In fact, through their interactions, people at the support function and the help desk, they are essentially reconstituting the dominance of development and their understanding. In fact, the company is quite skilled because it waits to inflect a very technical understanding of the software when the business users who order it vanish, and they're talking with people with a similar technical background, which are more likely to agree on the very technical details on which the software is ultimately judged, rather than how somebody would use it. And as part of this process, things like specification documents, service license agreements, and so on, they play a very important role, because in reconstituting the dominance of the development practice, you can abuse the fact that some are very specific and technical in case of the specification documents, and others are very ambiguous, to essentially make sure that we're going to work on this the way development wants to work on it, and no other way. The other problem is something which comes with the fact that the software is constantly revealing itself. It's not defined fully until you never update it anymore, which means, but it reveals itself differently to developers, people at support, the client technical stuff, and the business users of that software. What you need in order to actually get the job done properly and effectively is object committed involvement. You need people who will be engaged with the software at various stages to actually feed back the development how they work with the software. Yeah, and the problem for Montec is that sometimes people are just not committing in client organizations, and things take forever, or you end up with sudden realization that the client thinks that they got something different than what they ordered, because they simply were not committed to the software itself as something that is being defined throughout this entire process. Now, in fact, because the end user only sees the software at towards the very, very end, and there's a long period of time until even the technical staff get a version to play with for their internal tests, it's a deliberate move on part of Montech to not have the service license agreement cover those initial tests, because at that stage of time, that's where most of the issues will be ironed out. So you don't want to have that sort of like pressure to resolve something quickly. And last but not least, there's a very specific arrangement to all the practices that form this landscape that makes service delivery, gives service delivery its shape. On the one hand, we have practices which stretch or reinforce connections within individual projects. Yes, so Montech, support, help desk, clients, industry, and so on, customers, etc. On the other hand, we have practices which cut across projects, allowing and which manifest in Montech's continuous efforts to navigate essentially multiple projects at the same time, and sort of like keep all customers happy, but only to a certain extent. They are, because of these practice connections, in a position where, in order to successfully deliver services to multiple clients at the same time, they must act in a way which is not entirely in the best interest of an individual customer. Yeah. In other words, there's constant pushing. The customer wants things prioritized. Montech can't. They can't satisfy everyone. The pushing back and forth between Montech and the customer is completely unavoidable. So what this means for practitioners: one, think about who needs to be involved in the service delivery and how they will be interacted with, and when. When do you want the end user to come in? Do you want to push for a technical definition as the definition of the project, so that it's easier for you to justify you've done what you were planning? If that's the case, make sure that maybe find a way for the more end user business staff to drop out before you sign things off finally. Yeah, use more ambiguous terms during the initial stages of a project. Sometimes you can exclude parties that can be disruptive. So this is specifically the case with distributors who can, act not in your best interest, or third-party suppliers which may complicate network infrastructures. Even if that means, even if that means you will have no choice but to adopt a less optimal technical design. Avoid relying on other people's articulations because of that meaningfulness problem we mentioned. If you can, investigate things yourself. Yeah, Montech prefer having direct access to infrastructures. It's just that in a lot of cases they can't, because, well, the security of the client environment prevents them from doing so. Have everything in writing. Yeah, so clear technical language provides the IT service provider, in Montech in our case, with protection, control, and ability to charge for any unanticipated work. Ambiguous language is also good, but for a different way. You can downplay customer concerns over the urgency of a problem if there is no clear classification for different types of problems, rather vague categories which can move around a little bit. Be mindful of how anything you write down is used. Yeah, so think about, when do you want your service license agreement to kick in? You do it too early, you may be overburdened with work. It may distract you from other customers. Ensure that your client is not just committed to the project, as in the group meetings and so on, but actually participates in the working on the software. Goes through rigorous tests, does not put the burden of making sure it works on you, because you will never have their perspective. And last but not least, if you have to, upset your individual clients if you're delivering multiple projects at the same time, because that's the only way to satisfy all clients at the same time. Right, so that's, if somebody really struggles with sleep, there's like 4 slides worth of referencing here you can get your hands on, and that's a fraction of probably what you'd have to read to actually get a full grasp of this. Any questions?
Okay, thank you so much, Wojciech, for that. You can stop sharing. I found it very informative, very interesting. Don't worry, it wasn't. I think it was so much content, very interesting, very informative, very apt. And I think it was worth it at the end. I know we don't have so much time for questions, and I didn't want to stop you because it was so interesting.
No, you should have, because I could have speed up this through some stuff.
Yeah, but it's good, it's good. So any questions for Wojciech? Any questions at all? I can see from the chat, I think, let's see, I think it was John that was talking about, let's see, trying to see John's questions. John was talking about complaints of IT services spamming the market is a major frustration for people working in IT services here in the States. So any question for Wojciech? I think it's true clearly. I think it's something, is the IT, the message of the IT is not just unique to the UK, but also within the States as well, according to John. So any questions for Wojciech? Any questions at all? Feedback, comments, anything anybody wants to say?
Have you noticed? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Have you
Yeah.
noticed that developers tend to develop software and final products that are designed for other developers versus and then having the client input? So like my master's, I have a master's in administration and professional writing. And one of the emphasis was that we are the advocate for the end user of a product or service. And then many times the engineers that are designing a product are mostly focused on making things in their peer group, which is other engineers. So a lot of times when we see things coming through the system, we're supposed to review it and then contact the end user and then come back with the results from that back to the engineer saying, this works, this doesn't work, or it's overly complicated, because the mindset of the user might be different than the mindset of the engineer.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what was happening in the organization I researched. So, well, in a lot of the clients, because they're such massive organizations and there's people responsible with procurement and so on, technical staff that run the infrastructure and the existing software, you know, the problem was that sometimes you would have, especially when the relationship started, and in some cases this relationship in this company was 20 years long, you would have some manager coming in saying what they want without much detail, yeah, and then just handing it over to technical staff, yeah, which worked for Monte because, you know, they worked with technical people who supposedly were representing end users, but their conversation was always predominantly technical. And even when they, you know, especially in longer term relationships, eventually when you know, the software was going through the nth iteration, those development requests were a little bit more informed. The problem was that there were always little bolts that still had to be clarified when the actual end user got the function. Yeah, sometimes it was something very simple like accessibility, even, yeah, being able to go faster from one section of the software to another to identify where a problem lied. But yeah, that's kind of what this idea of object committed involvement means. As long as you have something, you ideally want to have end user input. In the ideal world, you know, because you essentially have, in case of this organization, you will do your internal testing based on an incomplete understanding of someone's infrastructure and a sample of a data which is very different from the real data because of security issues. You will then forward this on to technical staff who will do a test which is much more likely to be with what the end user will do. And then you have the mass enrollment of the live environment, which is when the actual end users would typically fully start exploring the software, even if they were involved in the acceptance test prior a little bit. So the problem is that, you know, there is a moment when you have something that is workable, usable, can act as a prototype. And that's really the only point where you can, when the end user can fully appreciate what they're getting. Prior to that, it's in the words of one of the developers, too much of a nebulous idea for them to actually visualize it. You can get a feel for it, but this level of back and forth and having to refine things, unless it's something that, you know, especially if it's something which is meant to be used as a tool rather than just, you know, give something like, I don't know, a sliced bread, which removes the need to slice bread yourself. So it makes no difference to you. If it's something that people will use, they need to actually start using to exactly have a full, perfect understanding of what they want from it. And sometimes they can't even get it because, well, coding has its obstacles. Certain things cannot be coded in a completely completely free way. That there are limitations of coding languages and IT infrastructure. Sometimes you will have to change your practice based on the closest to the thing, the thing you get, which is actually just the closest to the thing you maybe want.
Okay, thanks very much, Wojciech, for that. John, is that okay? Or do you want to ask more questions?
Well, I've known people who worked in IT going back 60 years, and so there's a lot of complications. There's sometimes you have software that supports pieces of machinery that generates data that has to be collected, and the communication between the two systems is actually done between two different vendors. And then it becomes in a negotiation of, well, whose problem is this when something stops working? So it turns into this real big, it's not my problem because this, and this. And then because these two vendors don't necessarily talk to each other because of privacy and confidentiality, you as the client now has to go to the other, it could be the software supporting, and then talk to them about, well, they said it's this, and this, and it's your problem. So then so you turn and you have this big back and forth sometimes between multiple parties, especially if there's multiple different vendors connected to it before you could even actually solve a problem.
Yeah, well, Montech is actually in that kind of business because a lot of banks have very robust infrastructure, some outsourced to a provider. Yeah. So what they would do is they would quite often ask, in order to avoid this politics of who owns the network, what they would do is they would ask themselves, right, can we get that data or something that comes close to it? Maybe it's a processed version from somewhere else, which is more accessible to us because it has this software design implications. Yeah. Plus it creates more and more unknowns, especially when you're trying to define software and you don't know the exact terms of accessing networks on a test environment, on a live environment. There's always questions which will surprise you that come later. That's unfortunately unavoidable. So their solution was always look for, you could call it the path of least resistance, to get the data you want from the network. But sometimes they had projects where, this type of politics you just described, John, literally meant that while they were working at a 3-week sort of like process on their end, what the client had to do was the party in between all these providers took them 3 months, and they were just sitting there in limbo waiting.
Okay, thanks very much, Wojciech, for that, and thanks, John. I know we're running out of time, but just to end this, one of the things that you said, Wojciech, was you would have used ethnography, likely, but you decided to take a case study approach because they didn't give you access. So do you feel that if you had used ethnography, maybe auto ethnography, where you're trying to reflect personally, do you think you'd have gotten better results compared to what you did?
Yes. The reason is, kind of like in a bicycle exercise, you can't really explain to me how you ride a bicycle. Yeah. And people, professionals, when you ask them to explain what they do in their work, they take a lot for granted because it's just so natural. So being observed things in practice theorizing is important because it allows you to, as an outsider, it allows you to observe the taken for granted aspects. Yeah. From physical layouts to how you navigate a piece of software as part of your work, things that if you ask someone, it just wouldn't even, and it would never cross their mind that this is something important because it's something they naturally do. So in practice theorizing, essentially, there is no substitute for observation. for that reason, especially when it comes to observing the more material aspects of work. So layouts, how tools are actually used by people. You know, we do things without reflection. So in our spoken accounts, they don't tend to show up.
Okay, thanks. I looked at it. Yeah, definitely. It's always a case for ethnography, but I still feel your work was strong with the way you're able to draw within the case study as well. And I like what I really love about your work is the diffractive analysis that you decided to steal from social sciences and adopt within the field of management. I think it's something that we need to do. But of course, within management, we do more thematic analysis, other forms of analysis, but diffractive analysis is not something that we sell a lot. I like the fact that you are pushing that as something that we should use as a template for coding, especially.
Well, the problem is induction is a little bit of a myth in a very pure form. So we romanticize induction as allowing the data to speak for itself. Yeah, but you get a few different people to read the exact same set of data, and they will come with different interpretations. They will probably have different codes. And that's why it's always good to have multiple people coding. Yeah. And even if you read Nigel King, so the guy who came up with template analysis specifically as a form of thematic analysis, even he kind of admits in one of his chapters, I think it's in the book by Castells, even he admits that, you know, the coding is not a complete explanation, but we kind of go for the easy way. You know, we come up with codes quite often on how frequently certain themes occur. If we have too much under a single code, we will break it down, but that doesn't explain, you know, how our thinking influenced what we found. Yeah. We always come with something. I mean, even phenomenologists, yeah, so people who under Husserl try to find the very essence of our experience, abandoned the idea of reading oneself completely out of one's preconceptions. And you know, and I think Alvesson and Skolberg in the book on reflexive methodology actually say that a lot of the research we do is actually not purely deductive, because we always bring something from ourselves, our preconceptions and preconfigured ways of thinking, and that affects our interpretation. It's not the raw data that feeds our interpretations. Yeah, and there's actually this beautiful article by Sven Brinkman where he says, well, if we're coding the data, we might as well code the theory that we plug into it.
Okay, thank you very much, Wojciech. I know if you continue this, we'll keep talking about it, but it was a fantastic presentation, fantastic methodology adopted, very creative. I love the abductive approach as well. And it was great to hear so much about the messiness of the IT service delivery. And of course, a good point from John as well. Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, Ayodele. And thanks every other person that came in and had to go out as well. I'm sorry that we spent more minutes than we expected, but I think it was worth it because of it was so educative and so informative and also very, very interesting as well. Either way, thanks everyone for attending. And of course, I think Ayodele is giving you a clap. The video will be available, and Wojciech will also share the slides with us so that we can get much more about it. And in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be having another one. It's quite different. I think it's not even different because we're looking at a different sector, but this time it's going to be in law, and we're going to be looking at litigation in child's rights. So please don't miss it. And if you've benefited so much from this, of course, the next 2 weeks, you'll be learning so much about child rights and litigation. But signing out right now, and for those that are going to have the bank holiday, have a great long weekend. And for those that, like John, that are in the States that are not going to have a holiday, have a great day. Thank you very much and see you next time.